Hello, friends. Hello, how are you doing? I would like to welcome you to Cultivate Your Mental Wealth. I am your host, Joyce Ozeh. And for those of you who do not know, I am a civil rights attorney living and working in Chicago. I am also a mental health advocate, though, with lived experience with mental health. What I mean by that is the things that we talk about on the show, the strategies, identifying, practical pushes, they are all things that have helped get me to a place of wellness. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. You can look back to our past shows for how I was able to go from a place of illness to a place of wellness. And this is called cultivating your mental wealth because it doesn't stop at wellness for us. We are designed to live in abundance. And it means that when we get well, we get to live in the overflow and share our wellness with our community. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And that's exactly what I hope for all of you. Let's cultivate our mental wealth. Let's move beyond illness to wellness because wellness is possible. Okay. So, before we get into it, I want to say it is so good to be back. We took a little bit of a break during Black History Month, but I saw y'all in January. How many of y'all tuned in for our January series and season? It was all about just how to start your new year afresh, how to set goals and objectives that you can actually meet, and just how to renew your mind. But before we get into the series for March, I want to do a quick check-in with the audience. Another overview that we're going to be doing is talking about how this theme for the entire year is called the Year of the Renewed Mind. Everything we talk about this year is going to fall under the larger theme of renewing our minds. We have a new series this month called Breaking Cycles, and then we're going to get into practical pushes. I hope that sounds good because that's what we got. But okay, let's move into audience check-ins. Let me know where you're tuning in from, where you're listening from. You already know that I love to hear from you. Let me know if you're in the Midwest, the West Coast. I especially love it when we find out that we have some international listeners. So let me know where you're tuning in from. And also, I want to know how you celebrated Black History Month. Yes. So for those of you who may be international or unfamiliar, February is Black History Month here in the United States, and we celebrate it by looking at our rich culture, our history, and it's more than just slavery and oppression. We honor those who came before us so that we can show up in spaces like this and have conversations like these, but we also look at how far we've come and where we're going. Black History Month is a time of celebration. We are Black every month, so it doesn't stop at February for us. But I would still love to hear how you celebrate Black History Month in February and how you celebrate Black History Month and yourself and your ancestors every day. I see that we already have folks telling us where you're tuning in from. Polly from, I think it's Southern California. Welcome. I hope it's not too rainy over there. I know it's been pretty rainy as of late. I hope you're staying dry and staying pretty warm. And Sherry from Brooklyn, New York. I love Brooklyn. Brooklyn, Harlem. I was just in New York, actually almost 6 months ago. So I love New York. I love the food. I love any kind of big city. Thank you both for joining us and letting us know where you're tuning in from. You can still do so if you have not already. Also, I know that I've been teasing y'all with our Gmail account for this show specifically. For those of you who do not know, I am a mental health advocate along with an attorney. And I look at specifically how to help you advocate for yourself and get to places of mental wellness in your life, in your job, in your personal relationships, just everywhere you find yourself. You deserve to show up as the best versions actually reach out to me one-on-one to share their stories about mental health and wellness. I've had people ask questions about their family members. I've had people ask me how to put on conferences about mental health and mental wealth. And I do all of these consultations for my listeners for free. So if you want to share your story and connect with me more personally, please email me at comethrive247@gmail.com. That is comethrive247@gmail.com. Share your story with me, share your journey, because guess what? Drum roll, please. In the month of April, it is going to be an audience listener focused show. I am so excited that we're finally doing this. I've been collecting your stories, collecting your questions for almost a year now. And if you want a shout out and your story or your question about mental health to be answered live on the show, please email at comethrive247@gmail.com and you can be a featured guest on the show. You're also able to share your story anonymously. In fact, the default is going to be anonymous unless you want to use your first name and where you're writing or reaching me from. But next month, at least the first part of the month, is going to be dedicated to my lovely listeners who want to talk about mental health, their stories, their journeys, and just how far they've come. It is very exciting. I have some great stories to share with y'all, and it's just a time to appreciate all of you for tuning in all this time. Okay, folks. Let's do another sweep of who's here. Oh my gosh, LaTanya from Chicago. I'm also in Chicago. Hey, Chi-Town. Also, Bed-Stuy, Sherry, yes. I wish that you could be a guest on the show because I love how y'all talk in Brooklyn. That may have been my fake Brooklyn accent. Don't judge me. But I love it out there. Thank you, Tanya, Sherry, Polly. I so appreciate all of you. And thank you for those who haven't yet commented, but who are still watching. I appreciate you being in this space. Okay, let's get into some housekeeping before we get into our discussion for today. This is a segment of the show that I like to call Setting the Room. So we are going to take a deep breath and just breathe. It's already Tuesday. For some of us, it has already been a week and a half, is what it feels like. But I want you to know that right now in this space, this is our time. This is our conversation. You are safe here and you are seen here. What does that mean? You can ask questions in the chat without judgment, without fear. And I will make sure that all the comments that you drop in that chat, I follow up on one-on-one. If you want to ask me questions more privately, you can email again at comethrive247@gmail.com. But remember, this isn't my space, this is our space. You are safe and you are seen. So you better take up some space because we have more than enough room for you. Also, I want to get into what we're discussing today. As I mentioned earlier, the theme of the month, this month in March, is breaking cycles. Yes, we are in the year of the renewed mind, where we're going to be focusing on how to renew our minds so that we no longer have to be who we've always been. All of those identities, the illness, the mental heaviness, and the emotional trauma that bring us down and keep us from living abundant lives, we are discarding this year as we practice and grow into a renewed mind. And specifically this month, we are talking about breaking negative cycles. Breaking negative cycles. This is going to be part one of a two-part series this month. So I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope you continue to tune in. Part two is going to talk about breaking and transforming those cycles. But tonight, we need to talk about how to even identify negative cycles. What is a negative cycle? Why is it important to identify cycles? How does it impact our mental health? So on, so forth. So, in part one of Breaking Negative Cycles, we're going to be talking about identifying those cycles. So, let's get into it. First, how many of y'all have heard of negative cycles? And if you haven't heard about it, you can probably put two and two together of what this could mean. But for those of you who are still a little bit unsure, let's unpack what a negative cycle even is when it comes to our mental health and our mental wellness. So, negative cycles are essentially just repetitive patterns or thoughts, behaviors, or emotions that are detrimental to our mental health and well being. We all have thought patterns and ways of thinking and behaviors, but the negative cycles are the ones that we need to call out and focus on because they hold us back from living lives that are abundant and lives that are full. Often, stress or trauma in our past are responses to what then becomes negative cycles. And what happens and what creates and cements it as a negative cycle is this stress or this trauma becomes ingrained in our minds over time. How many of y'all can relate to that? It's not just like, oh, you have a bad day, but that thing that happened to you when you were a child, whether it was a divorce from your parents being divorced, which actually affects children a great deal, whether it is abuse, whether it is experiencing a death in the family or death of friends. How many of you know that that kind of stress or trauma can become ingrained in your brain and in your thoughts that then create negative cycles? That is what we're talking about today, those negative patterns of thinking because of what's happened in the past. And these thoughts don't just stay in our minds. Our thoughts don't just live in our brains. They often manifest themselves in our personal relationships, our work habits, and even in our self-esteem. So why is it even important to identify negative cycles? You're like, Joyce, that's great. You've defined this really heavy thing. But why is it important to identify negative cycles? Well, identifying negative cycles is important because they directly impact our mental health. And we are all about renewing our mind, renewing our spirits, and giving ourselves the best opportunity to thrive. So if we have negative thinking patterns and negative cycles, it is impacting our mental health in an adverse or negative way. More specifically, let's look at the ways that our mental health is impacted when we have negative cycles of thinking. It actually perpetuates or continues negative thinking. Negative cycles reinforce patterns of bad thoughts in our brain. And what does that lead to? It leads to a pessimistic outlook on life, and it contributes to conditions like depression, anxiety, mood disorders that we are often aware of. I'm gonna tell y'all a story about someone that I know. I consider her a friend of mine who I realize, oh my goodness, she is just trapped in a negative cycle of thinking. It's to the point where she can't even remember that when she's telling me about something bad that's happened to her, she's already told me this exact thing months ago. But she's stuck in the place of her hurt. Can you relate to that? What I mean by that is there are legitimate stressful things and traumatic things that have happened to her. She has had friends stop talking to her out of nowhere without telling her why. She's had people not show up for her when she's invited them places, just completely not show up. She's dealt with isolation and suicidal ideation. So those are all legitimate traumas and stressors that she's experienced. But what has happened to her is she now sees the rest of her life through the lens of those negative experiences. What I mean is, if I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't get lunch with you on Saturday," she automatically thinks I've rejected her. It's not that, "Oh, I happen to be busy or my husband and I are doing something." She sees me not getting lunch as a personal rejection because she's been personally rejected. And I've learned how to communicate with her, how to converse with her, how to kind of de escalate the situation so that she understands where I'm coming from. But I also realize that she is trapped in a negative cycle of thinking that has given her a pessimistic outlook on everything, even things that are not personal to her. This is why it's so important to identify negative cycles of thinking, because it colors the way that we see everything. Do y'all know some people like this where they make things about them that weren't even personal? You can be like, "Oh, I can't do that." And they think it's a personal attack. Or you can make a comment and they think that you're attacking them. And it's not because they're bad people. They're just trapped in negative cycles that have given them a pessimistic outlook. This is why it's so important for us to identify these patterns of thinking. Why else is it important? And how else does negative cycles affect our mental health? Negative cycles of thinking or negative thought patterns also impair our ability to cope. Someone mentioned that your thoughts can be really bad, and sometimes it can force us to go to coping mechanisms or open up the possibility of substance abuse or even avoidant behaviors. What do I mean by avoidant behaviors? It means like acting like a legitimate situation doesn't exist. When I was very sick with anxiety and depression, and I had a lot of negative thought patterns, I would just avoid responsibilities. I would avoid friends, I would avoid family, I would avoid tasks, things I had to do around my house. I would just avoid because I was stuck in a pattern that overwhelmed me. I know people who self medicated. I have a good friend who's diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and for years she abused drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism because she wasn't able to identify the negative patterns and cycles that she was dealing with. Yeah, someone also mentioned that self neglect can happen. That is 100% true. If you have any experience with severe and debilitating depression, you know that sometimes even just getting up out of bed and taking a shower for the day can be and feel exhausting. Self neglect, not eating well, not sleeping well, not taking care of yourself. All of that can be the cause or what comes because of negative patterns of thinking, which is why we must call them out. Negative patterns also affect our self esteem and our own confidence. How you talk to yourself is not just something that comes out of nowhere. Listen to the words you speak about yourself because they originate from the way we think about ourselves. Scripture says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The heart, the mind, they're connected. So if we have negative thought patterns about ourselves, it can actually affect the way we even see ourselves. This is why I do the show and why I have these conversations, because we deserve to live lives that are full, that are abundant, and that are healthy. You deserve to be the largest version of yourself, the shiniest version, the brightest version, the most successful version of yourself. You can't be all that you were designed and deserve to be if you aren't able to identify negative patterns of thinking that affect the way that you see you. And if you don't see you as full, as bright, as capable, as strong, other people are going to have a hard time seeing you that way. The way you see yourself is also sometimes, oftentimes, the way other people see and receive you. So again, negative thought patterns goes to our self-esteem. and the way that we're able to see ourselves, the positions that we apply for, the relationships that we stay in, the love or lack of love that we accept. It's another reason why we should identify these thought patterns. Did you also know that negative thought patterns can disrupt your emotional regulation? And that is, it affects your ability to even regulate your emotions. It can be as bad as you being extremely volatile, temperamental, angry. I don't know if any of y'all have like struggled with negative thought patterns, but have you noticed that when you're in a bad and funky cycle of thinking, you get very irritable. You're not very patient, you're not very kind to others, and you're not kind to yourself. Emotional regulation helps us with our mental health and our mental wellness. So when we don't have those thought patterns that are positive, it's really hard for us to self-regulate. When something comes up that's disruptive or we have a bad day, instead of being like, okay, let me figure this out. Let me find a solution. Let me take a break and relax. You aren't able to regulate yourself in the way that you should, in the way that you deserve. It could also lead to social withdrawal. So I'm naturally an introvert. I say this often on the show. I say this often in real life, and very few people believe me. But I'm naturally an introvert, so my inclination is to withdraw anyways. But when you have negative cycles of thinking, it makes you want to withdraw and kind of go in your own cave even more than you normally would, which is really detrimental for us as human beings, because it doesn't matter if you're extroverted, introverted, ambiverted, which means you're kind of a little bit of both. We are social and communal beings. What does that mean? You and I, we are designed for community. We are designed to fellowship with each other, to connect with each other. It's why I love looking at your comments in the chat. It's why I love when I hear from you via email, because connection is literally what we were made for. And when we have negative thoughts, it makes us want to withdraw within ourselves, because it lies to us and tells us that no one cares about us and we're not lovable, we're not worthy. We need community, like some of y'all are saying, we need connection. So we need to make sure that we're identifying when our thought patterns aren't healthy, because we need to connect in the way that we were designed to. It also can create physical health issues. People mention sleep patterns being disrupted. I've seen that is so true. And it can also lead us to procrastinate and avoid important things like work assignment, school activities, care for our children. We need to make sure that this doesn't become strongholds in our lives. So in order to identify negative thought patterns, we know how it affects our mental health. But identifying requires us to get to the root of the issue. I wish I could show y'all. I have a ton of plants at my house. I used to have way more than I have now. But one of my plants has a lot of brown leaves. Okay? I promise I'm going somewhere with this. It has a lot of brown leaves. The brown leaves themselves aren't the problem. There is a root issue with my plant that is a problem, and the brown leaves are just the symptom of the problem. If I would go about trying to treat the leaves, I would never get to the root of the issue that my plant is having. This is why we must figure out the root causes of negative thought patterns in order for us to identify them, confront it, address it, and overcome it. Let's look at root causes. We have to consider that, again, root causes can include past trauma, environmental factors like the home you grew up in, your work environment, your community, and also behaviors that you learn. All of this can lead to the root cause of why you have negative thought patterns in your life. Let's look at a few. Did you know that your personal history and past trauma actually could be a root cause for negative thought patterns? You kind of mentioned this earlier. Your early life experiences and trauma can set the foundation for long-term negative thinking and behaviors. Don't diminish something just because it happened to you when you were a kid. Don't tell yourself, ugh, you were 6, you should get over it. You were 7, you should get over it. Did you know that we are nothing more than a bunch of adults trying to heal from what happened to us as kids? The rulers of the world that you see that are bent on killing, violence, I dare you to tap into their childhood and see some of the things that they experienced and what happened there. It is okay to identify things that happened to you in your childhood early on that you still need to heal from. All of us are navigating that trauma, that stress, and I don't want you to diminish it, thinking that it's something that you should get over. And I also don't want you to think that it's not something that could still affect you. So look at your personal history, look at your past trauma. It doesn't have to be who you will always be, but it could be an indicator as to why you have patterns of thinking. Was it a coach that told you this? Was it your mother that told you this? It all started from somewhere. Also consider environmental and social factors. High stress environments and societal pressures can contribute to feelings of inadequacy and stress. And this can reinforce negative cycles of thinking. What is your environment like? Who are your friends? Who are the people that you keep around you? How do they speak? Every word spoken in your environment cultivates the way you think, and it could be positive or negative. So be mindful of environmental factors that could be part of the root cause for negative thinking. What about psychological factors? Mental health condition and cognitive biases, like things that make us not so neutral in our thinking, can sustain patterns of negative thinking and behavior. What did I say about my friend who experienced a lot of rejection? Now she goes out seeking ways to confirm what she believes is true. Confirmation bias. We all have personal beliefs, and depending on what happens to us, we are looking for pieces of evidence to tell us, aha, I knew it. I knew the world wasn't good. Look at what happened to me there. Or I knew that people are evil. Look at what happened to me here. Those are biases that we subconsciously look for, that means without realizing, to reinforce certain patterns of thinking. And when they're negative reinforcement, it's really hard for us to get out to the other side. That's a psychological factor. Let's also look at behavioral habits. We talked about this. Relying on unhealthy coping mechanisms in a response to stress can become ingrained and negative behaviors. We know the familiar ones. It's been a long day at work. It's 5 o'clock. It's happy hour. Let me get a drink or two to make myself feel better. I've said it before. I love a craft cocktail. I am personally not against socially drinking every once in a while. However, we should be mindful of self-medicating and relying on certain behaviors to make us feel better, to cope. Again, making yourself aware of these things isn't an acceptance of this cycle. By calling out negative cycles of thinkings, you're not accepting them, and you're also not saying that these cycles are unchangeable. By calling out and identifying these cycles, we are just recognizing the need for a transformation. We are recognizing and stepping in to a renewed mind and mindset. Recognizing negative thinking is the very first step for the transformation that you want and that you deserve. Avoidance isn't healing. Confront and overcome. You are more than capable of doing that. So we've had our discussion for today. I want to get into some of the comments. Thank you so much for all of the comments that have been coming in. I love what Brenda was saying about how your thoughts can actually heal you. Brenda, you've looked at my show notes for 2 weeks from now. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about strategies for breaking the cycle. And you are absolutely right. Just like your thoughts can make you sick, your thoughts, like Brenda said, can actually heal you. My thoughts healed me. So let's talk about it in a couple weeks. Also, drinking tea, that's so beautiful. Tea can be a good thing, especially when they have herbs in it, as a natural healing regimen for your body. Yes, your thoughts can make you sick. Sherry was talking about eating patterns being thrown off. Exactly. When you have negative cycles of thinking, it actually affects our body's ability to do what it does best, which is heal us and sustain us. It affects our sleeping, not eating, overeating. I can relate to the overeating sometimes. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's especially tough, as Tanya said, when you're already dealing with mental illness. Yes, negative thought patterns can compound or make mental illness worse. And sometimes it can actually sustain or perpetuate mental illness. That's a good point, LaTanya. We need community, 100%. Suffering and death in your family can also be really difficult in a way that these negative cycles begin. And yes, when you have mental illness, it becomes difficult to be able to come out of those negative habits. Yes, it makes it difficult. I know from personal experience, but I also want to tell all of you, it's possible. You don't have to be who you've always been. I'm living proof. Thank you so much for those of you who have been commenting. Continue to comment. I will follow up after the show. But let's look forward at what we can be talking about next time when it comes to continuing our theme of the year, cultivating a renewed mind, and discovering part 2, which is breaking and transforming negative cycles. As a reminder, this is going to be in 2 weeks, but in April, we will be highlighting some of your stories from the audience. If you have questions, personal testimonies, anything that you want to share, you can share it with your name or anonymously. We will have an entire episode dedicated to my faithful audience members who have been emailing me and keeping in touch. So again, I've already received a few stories. There's room for a few more. So get in while you can by emailing at comethrive247@gmail.com so you can share your story, your testimony, and talk about ways that you cultivate your mental health and how you've overcome. Okay, we've come to my favorite part of the show, so stay tuned for practical pushes on everything we've discussed. Stay tuned. Okay, friends, we're winding down, and this is our segment called Practical Pushes, where we go through everything we've discussed so that you have practical tips to sustain you until we meet again and beyond that. So let's focus on breaking negative cycles by identifying them. It is less daunting than it sounds, I promise. And it is a practice, and you are more than equipped to carry yourself through this practice. What if we learned how to identify and confront negative thoughts instead of avoiding them? I grew up hearing that negative thoughts are bad, obviously. Don't call them out, don't name them, just act like they don't exist. How many of us have been taught to not acknowledge these negative or intrusive thoughts? Let me know if you've been told that growing up or even recently. What do we always say on this show, though, for those of you who've been watching? You can't address what you don't confront. You cannot address what you do not confront. If you want something different for your life, if you don't want to be who you've always been, you have to confront these negative thoughts head on, and you're more than capable of that. But what does that look like? I challenge all of you, myself included, to practice journaling for awareness. What can that look like? Start a journal where you document instances of negative cycles as you notice them throughout the day or throughout the week. How are you talking about yourself? What are the words that go through your mind when you make a mistake at work or with your kids? How are you reacting to challenges? Are you telling yourself, ugh, I can't do this, or oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, this is just too hard? Instead of ignoring those negative thoughts, write them down. I want you to call them out, identify them, notice when you get triggered and what your response to those triggers are. Because again, identifying these thoughts and these patterns are the first step to healing, overcoming, and self awareness. This will help you move forward in a way that breaks cycles of negative thinking and that gets you closer to the life of mental health and mental abundance. And in part 2 of our series, after identifying negative thoughts, we're going to talk about how to break these negative cycles so you get to live the fullest version of yourself. I'm telling you, friends, wellness is for us. So let's thrive. See you soon. Thanks for joining.